Welcome everybody to this H3D Foundation webinar. I'm Nicola Elliott-Wong and it's my great pleasure to host these sessions. We're thrilled to have such a wide and growing subscription, so thank you so much for carving out the time to join us. It's really fans of flames of what we're trying to do down here from Cape Town. So I'm really thrilled today to be joined by a great friend of the Foundation and of GCADA, Laura Stennett from LifeArc. And I'm going to kick us off by reading her bio and then hand over quite quickly so that we have as much time for Q&A as possible. Dr. Laura Stennett is a Senior Business Development Manager at LifeArc, focused on building collaborations and strategic partnerships to deliver impact for those living with a rare disease. Prior to her current role, Laura worked to provide intellectual property management and technology transfer support to the Medical Research Council's Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, UK, having gained experience at some of London's leading technology transfer organizations, including Cancer Research Horizons, Imperial Innovations, UCL Business, and Queen Mary Innovation. Laura is a scientist by training with research experience in oncology and parasitology. She completed her PhD at King's College London and Bart's Cancer Institute, focusing on cancer metastasis and developing tools to track invasive cells in vivo using dual modality imaging. During her PhD, Laura also spent time at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, evaluating the role of leishmania attachment to the midgut of permissive sandfly vectors in parasite transmission. Laura has an undergraduate degree in biomedical science with intercalated year from the University of Warwick, during which time she spent a year at MRC Technology, now LifeArc, using cell-based assays to screen novel compounds for internal drug development programs. I knew I was going to struggle with something. Okay, Laura, thank you so much for being here. And guys, how the presentation goes, as always, is save your questions or populate the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session where you can ask all your questions. Laura, thank you so much for doing this. I know it's a really busy time of the year for you, but we're thrilled to have you and thank you. So I'm going to hand over to you now and enjoy the presentation, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nicola, for the kind introduction. Okay, and if we can just confirm that those are all coming through.
It looks great. Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, yes, thank you very much, Nicola, to H3D Foundation for having me to present to you all today. It's a real pleasure to be with you to talk a little bit about writing a successful translational grant funding proposal and sort of sharing some top tips from a funder's perspective. So if I just kick off just to give a little bit of an introduction to LifeArc and who we are. So we are a UK-based not-for-profit life science organisation, and our focus really is on shaping the future for people with rare diseases and addressing global health challenges, including antimicrobial resistance. And we do this through various mechanisms, so through our internal scientific capabilities, translational expertise and partnerships. And a lot of what we do is sort of funding fantastic science and trying to help progress it to the next stage. So hopefully I can give you some insights as to what we typically look for as a funder when we're opening our grant calls. So just to quickly touch upon what I'm going to talk through today. So I'll first just give an overview of what we're talking about and what we mean when we talk about translational research, before then touching upon sources of funding and how to identify funding opportunities. And we'll talk a little bit about the typical funding process and how funding decisions are typically made, before delving into the anatomy of a typical funding application and sharing some top tips, hopefully, for success. Before opening the floor for Q&A. So just to sort of set the scene as to what we're talking about when we're talking about translational research. So really we're looking at projects focused on everything from sort of target validation through to clinical or field trials. So you can see here the translational research stages. And if we map that onto what we typically refer to as technology readiness levels, And this is a tool that enables to basically identify where a technology or a novel therapeutic or diagnostic is within that development pathway. Really what we're looking at for translational research is anything from this sort of TRL3, so this proof of concept stage, all the way through to TRL9, so real world pre-commercialization and commercialization to deliver patient impact. So in terms of what translational projects typically involve, just by nature, they tend to be multidisciplinary in nature and require different expertise and collaboration in order to deliver them, which is slightly different from sort of discovery or earlier stage projects. In terms of the funding calls we typically put out, they tend to be a quite clearly defined remit or scope. And as part of that, we expect to see projects to be clearly defined and milestone based, which allows us as funders to tranche the funding so that you can ensure that the project is developing along that critical path, and to ensure that funding is best being used in order to help develop what's eventually going to be a clinically successful therapeutic or diagnostic, for example. I'm really keen with translational research, and particularly when you're applying for these sorts of grants, is to consider the more downstream aspects, so future development and commercialization, and sort of intellectual property, which we'll touch upon a bit later, and also considering patient impact and sort of the ultimate end goal that you're trying to achieve. So in terms of sort of sources of translational funding, I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to anyone on the call, but there's various pots that are typically available, and often universities or research institutions will have their own internal pots of funding, which tend to be slightly smaller and sort of geared towards internal applicants, and typically these are set up to allow applicants to leverage larger or international grants. Another source, obviously, is sort of charities and foundations, and us at LifeArc are a key example of that. And typically, we tend to fund projects either through annual grant calls or sort of a more specific one-off bespoke call in a specific area. And importantly, there tends to be sort of terms and conditions attached with that. There may be IP considerations and publication requirements, that will very much depend on the remit of the funder. Another source of funding for these sorts of projects, obviously, is sort of industry funding, and this can be projects conducted in collaboration with industry, and typically these tend to be aligned with strategic areas of focus. So in terms of identifying the right funding opportunity, it can be quite challenging to navigate sort of a really broad landscape, but a really good way of approaching this is to set up alerts and subscribe to email newsletters, and using tools such as Google search can be really helpful to get sort of notifications regularly through against sort of keywords that may be aligned to your research areas. And it's really good to get into the habit of routinely checking and also sort of more broadly building your network in the translational research space, as it can be a fantastic opportunity to collaborate, particularly on sort of larger multidisciplinary projects. And really the key here is to take a targeted approach for success. So you want to ensure that you're not just applying for everything that's available, but really honing in on those opportunities that very clearly align with your research area of focus, to ensure that you're putting out quality proposals, you're saving time and effort, and increasing your chances of securing that funding ultimately. So if we just move on to think about what is involved in writing a high quality application, I think the key message to convey here first and foremost is that grant grantsmanship really is an art form, and it requires practice and sort of over time honing those skills to really craft a proposal that tells a compelling story and sort of really articulates your narrative. In terms of what we as funders tend to be looking for, so there will be three main components which we tend to focus on. The science obviously is paramount. You know, we want to ensure that the science underlying your proposed technology is robust and well validated, and you know that you have the data to support that. We also then want to see that there's a well thought out plan that sits alongside your proposal. So have you considered that, what that critical path to success looks like, and how does that map out in terms of your project milestones? And then the final thing, which is particularly relevant for translational research, is obviously the impact of the work. So what is it that you are trying to ultimately achieve, and thinking really beyond the end of the current project and sort of thinking towards sort of patients and how you're ultimately going to solve the problem that you've identified. So just a couple of things to flag to consider before you start applying. So as I mentioned before, a targeted approach is really important, but it's also important to really consider whether the funding call which you're looking to apply for, the remit aligns with the proposed project to ensure that it's in scope. You're also going to want to ensure that you are eligible as an applicant, as some funding calls will tend to be geared towards specific groups. So, for example, early career researchers. So it's really important to clarify that up front. Also helpful is to confirm the amount of funding available for projects and eligible costs. And, you know, sometimes funders will indicate how many projects they anticipate to fund in a given call. So that can be helpful to just to, you know, be able to assess chances of success. And really make sure beforehand that you familiarise yourself with the application process, deadlines anticipated, and critically that any supporting documents or guidance that's been given is addressed, because not all funders will reach out to sort of chase and follow up for any supporting documentation. Sometimes that can mean that you won't be considered to progress. So really important that you make sure that all of that information is in hand before applying. So just to talk a little bit now about the funding process itself, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of this, but you know, typically stage one involves sort of a submission of an initial application or an expression of interest, which tends to be fairly short, may include some non-confidential and confidential sections, but really the idea here is just to provide a high-level overview of the project and the unmet need that you're looking to address. And here really is your opportunity to grab the attention of funders and the experts who will be reviewing your application by really outlining the strengths of the proposal and highlighting any gaps that are to be addressed and how you're going to address those. And as I mentioned before, thinking about any sort of intellectual property or commercialization considerations is important here as well. And this will typically be reviewed internally by a funding committee before shortlisting and invitation to full application. So once you've reached the full application stage, again, the funding organisation will typically review that internally, but quite often that will also be reviewed and the decision-making process will be supported by peer review. So this will be experts in the field who may be scientific or subject matter experts who will give a written review of the robustness of the proposal and give a recommendation for funding. Typically, this peer review then will feed into the sort of broader panel review. So this will be a panel of experts who will be brought together based on their experience and skill sets in order to make a final recommendation to the funders. And the panel will typically review all full applications that have come in, essentially, to help guide those funding decisions, which may or may not be conditional depending on the feedback from the panel. So in terms of how funding decisions are made, so I touched upon this briefly earlier, but worth highlighting here that really first and foremost, the science and the research proposal is absolutely key here. But of course, when shortlisting projects and trying to sort of narrow down applications, there will also be consideration as to how the proposed project fits within the funding call and the scope, and also consideration as to whether the project team is able to deliver the research which has been articulated. So making a really compelling argument that you have the expertise, facilities or partnerships in place to deliver the work is key. And then, as I mentioned previously, IP and downstream development and commercialization strategy will also be considered, because ultimately, whilst the success of the current project is critical, the funders will typically want to see that you've considered beyond the lifetime of that project and how you will progress the technology afterwards. So just to talk now a bit about the anatomy of a funding proposal. So the first section typically that you'll be asked to populate is a project summary and sort of really outlining the project objectives as part of that. So this is giving an overview of your project plan and a sort of high-level summary of what you're trying to achieve. And it's important really that this provides the context and the necessary background for your proposal. So you should really be pulling out key information from later sections into this project summary, and using sort of supporting information and well-researched data to support the narrative that you're trying to tell. And similarly, as I mentioned before, there may well be non-confidential and confidential sections. So in terms of how you sort of tailor your approach to writing these sections, really when you're looking at a non-confidential project summary, you're looking at providing an overall overview in sort of lay or plain English summary. So this will be for a general audience and will typically be used in order to identify peer reviewers and manage any conflicts of interest. The technical summary, on the other hand, is slightly different, and typically this is confidential. And this should be tailored to a specialist reader who may be an expert in the field. So this is what will be provided ultimately to peer reviewers once they've accepted and said they're happy to review. They will review that under a confidentiality agreement to ensure that sort of all that background is well articulated. So the next section typically you'd expect to see is the project team, and this feels fairly straightforward in terms of sort of just listing who your principal investigator and co-investigators are for the project and their details. But really the importance here of highlighting the project team is to really articulate what expertise the team have in place to deliver the project. So you want to ensure that you are highlighting what each collaborator brings to the project and why they are adding value as part of this multidisciplinary teams. Also important to highlight as well is that if there is additional expertise required that sits outside of that core project team, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate how you will obtain these expertise and in a timely manner. So, you know, have you identified expertise that you're able to tap into as part of the project, and how will you go about engaging the necessary people? So the third section that I'll talk through today is around the rationale for the project. So in a similar way to the project summary, this should dig into more detail as to why the project is important and why it should be funded, essentially. So tapping into all of these areas that I've shown here on screen is really important, and we'll talk through these one by one in the next few slides. So the first thing to highlight, and I've mentioned this a few times already, but it really is critical, is highlighting the unmet patient need that you are seeking to address, and not only identifying the problem you're trying to solve, but really demonstrating how your product or solution meets or addresses this unmet patient need. In the context of this, you're really going to want to consider the current treatment options, if there indeed are any, or what the standard of care looks like, and how your product or solution improves on that. So if there's currently, if there's currently no standard of care, then there's a clear sort of gap for your product or solution. But if one exists already, you're going to want to demonstrate the advantages of your approach. And you can consider here as well whether it's a platform technology that you're working on. So could your product or solution be applied to multiple indications or patient populations? So really thinking broadly about who might benefit from what you're looking to develop. So the next part of providing that scientific rationale, obviously is critically important, is providing that scientific evidence. So really including all the necessary information and technical description about the technology to really provide all the necessary details to evaluate that in depth. And importantly, you're going to want to provide evidence for the scientific rationale. So linking your target, for example, to clinical indications and outcomes. And you can pull in here both your own data and also external data to really support that narrative. Also important is to obviously highlight the stage of development. So you're going to want to talk about all of the work that's been done to date and why that work has been done to date. If there's any sort of preparatory work that's been done, which will also feed into the current project, that can be really helpful. So thinking about things such as assay development or samples that you may have which you're going to want to use in the current project. And importantly, you want to ensure that all key supporting literature, so all references are included to ensure that that's properly referenced. And just to flag on the bottom right hand side there, I've sort of highlighted around gaps and inconsistencies, because I think it's really important here to remember that not every project or data to date will be absolutely perfect. We recognise as funders that there may be gaps or inconsistencies which need to be addressed, but don't be afraid to highlight these and really draw out where they will be addressed in the current project plan, or provide the rationale where relevant to really support why those exist. Because what you don't want is to leave any ambiguity with reviewers asking questions as to why some things maybe don't make sense. So the next thing to consider as part of rationale, and apologies, this is a slightly busy slide, but this is just to highlight the importance of considering the patient pathway. So you've already identified your unmet need, but really you're thinking here about how your product or solution fits into the current patient pathway. So how easy is it for patients to receive a diagnosis to inform treatment decisions, if at all? It might well be that a diagnostic test or access to diagnosis isn't available. Also important to consider who makes treatment decisions and will prescribe or administer your product solution, and in what setting does that typically occur. Because obviously you will want your product or solution to be able to fit into that. And if it doesn't fit into that, then you're going to have to articulate a clear narrative as to how you will create that paradigm shift in order to allow adoption of your technology. It can also be helpful here to think about who will pay for your proposed product or solution, and increasingly important for funders is really considering patient and public engagement plans. And typically funders will want to see that you've not only considered end users and patients, but also had some engagement with these groups ahead of time to help shape your proposal. Again, to ensure that the project is setting you on that critical path for patient impact. Then the next aspect to understand, and it might well be that you don't have a full holistic view of the market, but it can be really helpful to consider the broader context under which you are developing your product or solution. So think about if you're developing a novel therapeutic, are there other therapeutics on the market already that are being used for your target indication or addressing the problem which you're also aiming to address? How far developed are these solutions? And you can think about, obviously, in industry assets, but also other work that's happening in academia as well. And just thinking about how you will position your product or solution within the broader context. And I've just included some examples below, demonstrating that a lot of this information can actually be found online. So it's worth just having a quick search just to double check and make sure that you've considered the market when you're writing your proposal. And really, this all feeds into thinking about the competitiveness of your approach. So as I've sort of alluded to before, demonstrating here how your product or solution solves the problem you've identified, but also the competitive advantage it has over other competing technologies. And there will be some cases, particularly in LifeArc, working in the rare disease space, often there are no competing technologies. Sometimes in sort of larger indications, there will be alternative products that have already been have already reached the market, and therefore you're going to want to highlight how you are differentiated. I'm really considering the extent to which your approach is novel, innovative, and timely. So the fourth section I'll talk about is something which you won't always be asked to provide as part of a funding application, but it's really important to consider, as this can really help with the setting of your project plan and ensuring that you have clear, achievable milestones. And really what we're talking about here is a target product profile, or TPP. And what this does is it outlines the desired profile or characteristics of your target product or solution, which is aimed for a particular disease or set of diseases. And here you're looking to define the essential attributes of a clinically successful product. And as I say, once you've sort of articulated what that end goal is, that then allows you to form the basis of your development plan and have something to work towards, essentially. So in terms of what this typically covers, I won't go through this in too much detail, but really you're looking to clearly define the indication and the population of patients that your product will address. You're also going to want to provide some more quantitative measures, so thinking about clinical efficacy and what level of efficacy is required, and how you're going to measure it. And thinking also about things such as safety and tolerability, so setting thresholds for what a sort of validated and safe product looks like. There's also more downstream aspects as well, so thinking about dosing frequency and treatment duration, route of administration, and considerations such as stability and price and reimbursement. And, you know, really important to remember that this is very much a snapshot, and it may well evolve over time, but, you know, by sort of thinking about this early, it really allows you to set yourself on the right track when you're developing a project plan. So just to give you an example as to what a target product profile would typically look like, there are some quite good sources of information available online. So the WHO, for example, have published target product profiles for some indications, and there are also TPPs that have been published in the academic literature as well. But these tables here in green just demonstrate ideally what you'd be looking to pull together. So thinking about what would be sort of the desired or ideal target in terms of your product, but also setting a sort of minimal or acceptable threshold as well. And because again, that will allow you to develop your project milestones. So that brings me on quite nicely to thinking about your project plan. And I'm sure everyone on the call has probably had experience of developing a project plan, but really important to highlight here in terms of what we as funders are expecting to see is sort of the intended plan of work broken down into distinct work packages. And each of those should have a key project deliverable or milestone at the end. And again, this is where thinking about what sort of minimal or acceptable targets and what would the ideal targets be when you're setting those milestones. And how we typically tend to think about this is thinking about SMART milestones. So what we mean by that is ensuring that there is enough detail included to ensure that your objectives are specific. So you want them to be written in clear and concise and understandable terms. You don't want to leave any ambiguity. You also want them to be measurable and quantitative. So set realistic and justifiable success criteria, and that may well be sort of a target range or acceptable cutoff values. And that will be based obviously on the types of assays that you're running, for example, and what you would consider to be successful to justify moving the project on. You want to also make sure, though, that your milestones are achievable. You want them to be realistic. Don't be too ambitious because you'll never meet them. And as I've mentioned previously, funding tends to be tranched and milestone based. And so, you know, you want to set a realistic objective, but not so ambitious that you're never going to meet it and funding may be stopped. You want to also ensure, obviously, that the milestones are relevant and helping you to progress your project along a critical development path, and also that they're timely. So you want to set a deadline as to when you will achieve the outputs of those objectives by, instead of having sort of a long duration, for example. So just to demonstrate what we mean here, you can see on the left an example of fairly poor milestones. You can see they're very high level, doesn't give much detail. But then on the right, we've got our SMART milestones. So it's really summarizing what you're going to do, in what form you're going to do it, what the ideal and acceptable outcome measures of that milestone are, and by when you're going to achieve that milestone. And a really good way of thinking about distinct work package in the packages in the context of a project plan is to map things out in a Gantt chart. So you'll see below this is a sort of relatively simple Gantt chart as to how each of the work packages align and stack up next to each other. You'll see there's a line for milestone review, and this really helps to demonstrate and provide a visual representation as to how the different work packages will flow into each other and how key decision points will be made within the project. So moving on to the next section that you will be asked to provide information on. And really, this is around deliverability of the project. So I mentioned before that funders will want to see that an appropriate team are in place and that the necessary expertise are available to you. But this also applies to resources. So this can be tangible resources. So, you know, do you have access to the cell lines or animal models or infrastructure that you need to deliver the work? As well, as I said, as sort of collaborators and expertise. Thinking as well here around project management. So it's not necessarily for sort of smaller projects required that you need sort of a dedicated project management resource, but demonstrating that you have experience within the team of delivering similar projects, so similar size and scale, can be really helpful. And thinking about sort of key risks and how you'll mitigate against those as the project progresses. And then, of course, thinking about financial considerations. So you're going to want to make sure that you include a full breakdown of payments that are required and your full payment schedule and how that aligns to the specific work packages. Worth noting that sometimes funders will expect funding to be broken down by expense category or year, or sometimes there will be work package specific. But really importantly is that if there's any sort of outsourced work, that you provide justification for the amounts that you're requesting, and it can be helpful to append quotes in the supporting documentation to demonstrate that. So moving on to the next section, I touched upon competition briefly in the context of considering the broader market, but what is also important to consider is in the context of intellectual property. So if there are lots of competitive solutions being developed, you're going to want to ensure from an intellectual property perspective that you are free and unencumbered to develop your given technology with ideally a strong IP position, but it's not necessarily an essential requirement as long as you've considered how you will manage intellectual property throughout the lifetime of the project and beyond. So in terms of what we mean when we refer to intellectual property, so a lot of people instantly assume we're just referring to patents here, and patents can be very important. They can be a really fantastic tool, especially when it comes to commercialization. But really, here we're looking more holistically, so including things such as trademarks, copyright, designs, and database rights as well, which are all different forms of intellectual property. Another critical form of intellectual property that many don't consider is actually know-how and trade secret. And particularly in early stage projects, this is particularly relevant because what this refers to is unpatented technical information that's not in the public domain. So if you have any proprietary data, any preclinical or clinical data, any methodologies you've developed, models, manufacturing processes, or indeed reports, all of this is very valuable intellectual property that you will either be bringing into the project or developing throughout the project, and so should absolutely be considered alongside the registrable rights such as patents. So in terms of the sections that we would typically ask you to populate and things to think about, obviously thinking about background IP. So what intellectual property are you bringing into the project that's going to be developed, and thinking about who owns that. You know, do you have the rights in hand to be able to use that for the project and beyond? Thinking also about foreground IP. So what intellectual property, including know-how that we've mentioned, will be generated in the project, and who's going to own that. Thinking, as I said, around a strategy for protecting intellectual property, you know, and that may or may not include patents, but just having that mapped out as part of the project and beyond is really important. And critical here is really thinking about plans for publication in the context of your intellectual property strategy, because know-how and trade secrets must remain confidential. It's important that in order to get a patent granted, that the subject matter has not been publicly disclosed. So you're going to want to ensure that you've considered plans for publication in the context of how you're protecting your intellectual property to ensure that the timing is right. And I think, you know, important to highlight here is, where possible, I would urge you to seek expert advice and support in this area, either from your research office or technology transfer or commercialization office, where applicable, because they should be able to guide you as to how to fill out these sections. And then section 8 to think about really is downstream development. So think articulating that credible route to market and achieving patient impact. For later stage projects, it can be important to touch upon aspects such as regulatory, the regulatory pathway for approval, or manufacturing considerations if you're sort of running clinical stage projects. You're going to also want to highlight onward sources of funding, so demonstrating that you've really thought about, you know, once you've completed the current project, how will you then take that forward, and what sources of funding will you target in order to reach that next stage of development. And also important to consider other deliverables as well as just the immediate project outcomes. So knowledge generation and dissemination, again, in the context of your broader IP strategy, but thinking also about patient and public engagement and how you're bringing those end users along with you on the journey. So this is my last slide really before wrapping up for a summary, but just to highlight that obviously successfully applying for and receiving grant funding is very much just the start, and the fun comes with delivering the work, but what's important to remember is that actually contracting can take some time, and ensuring that all the collaborators and everything is in place from a contractual perspective in order to frame the project, as well as, of course, the getting the funding agreement in place. There's obviously a lot of project and stakeholder management involved in these sorts of projects, particularly if they're sort of large multidisciplinary projects. So really important to consider that. And, you know, a key stakeholder, of course, is the funder. So making sure that you are keeping up with reporting requirements and keeping them apprised of any updates as the project progresses. And of course, I'm sure this is not news to anyone online, but yeah, just making sure that you acknowledge sources of funding in other publications or presentations is really important as well. So I've talked through a lot of information quite quickly, I appreciate, but just to sort of wrap up the top tips for success. I'm really thinking about that from the project level. So I've said it many times, but really understanding the unmet medical need is critical, and being able to articulate that in a clear and concise way. And talking about the rationale for the project. So why do you want to conduct the project? Deliverability, as we've talked about, is critical. So really thinking about how you're going to deliver the program of work, and that route to patients, of course, is really important, and making sure you have your success criteria and milestones well outlined. And then finally, just from a sort of proposal perspective, so actually writing your application, we've touched upon this, but it's really important to craft a compelling narrative. You want to be clear and concise, and making sure that all the information that the funders have requested is outlined. Developing a clear and realistic budget is really important, and ensuring you work closely with any sort of supporting functions within your research institution or university is really important to help get that in a good shape. And ensuring really that the budget aligns with the project scope. So you don't want to be inflating any costs unnecessarily, but do make sure that you've well budgeted to ensure that you can actually deliver the work you intend to. As with sort of writing an academic manuscript or publication, really important to review and edit for clarity and coherence. Check again that everything makes sense and everything is well written, and that will help ensure that you're submitting a polished and professional proposal when the time comes. And really do make sure that you check any submission guidelines and deadlines before pressing send. So with that, we'll stop there. I've got a link there to the LifeArc website and also my name there to connect on LinkedIn, and happy to take any questions. So.
Thank you so much. And I can already see from the chat there's some urgency around around getting questions answered. I've got a question, and just to kick us off, and everybody else, if you'd like to raise your hand to get into the queue to ask questions, feel free to do that. You will be able to unmute yourself in a minute. So my question is two parts to my question. The first would be, what is a typical timeline of writing a proposal that people should sort of prepare for? So, how could you get it done in a week, or does it take 18 months? What is that? And then my second part of that question is, who would you typically be working with on this proposal? So what does the team often look like? Is it something that you should be thinking up and capable of thinking up all on your own? Or is there, what sort of members of your team might you like to draw in to contribute to this proposal?
Very, very good, both very good questions. So to tackle the first one, I think in terms of timelines, it can be variable depending on the sort of the call. So sometimes it will be you'll have sort of a couple of months between applications open and submission deadlines. I think the important thing to emphasize is to give yourself enough time to really think carefully about the proposal. As I said, you want to sort of review and review again before submitting. So, a week is definitely unrealistic. Particularly if you're not sort of repurposing another proposal and sort of have a basis to start on. But even then, you're really going to want to tailor your application to the specific funding call that you're targeting. So yeah, giving yourself enough time to have the necessary conversations and bring all that together is really important. In terms of who you typically want to work with, I think, that will depend again on sort of what level of researcher you are. So if you are working as part of a team, you're going to obviously want to bring your PI along with you for the ride, and they will obviously have want to help shape the proposal, as it's obviously research being conducted within their lab. I think obviously if you're at the PI level, then you're absolutely looking to engage early with collaborators and sort of really being able to have those broader discussions to form and shape that multidisciplinary team. So so from the sort of scientific side, those are the conversations to be had. I think in terms of the sort of broader support, you know, if you are able to access resources via the university or research institutes, via sort of a research office or technology transfer team, those professionals will have lots of experience in sort of supporting similar applications. So for some of the slightly more complex sections, you know, intellectual property or the budget, for example, they are absolutely able to help feed into that. And so early engagement is absolutely encouraged.
Thank you. That's very useful. Okay, anybody else would like to ask a question? I'm not seeing any hands, but you can write them in the chat or just unmute yourself. I know there's been a question if the slides are shareable, Laura. How do you feel about that? Do you have some shareable slides that I could?
I will have to check with my my colleagues internally, but I'm sure absolutely that I'd be able to share the deck. I'm sure that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, it looks like there are no questions. So then I've got one other question which I'd like to ask, seeing as nobody's raising their hand, which is transitioning from being in the lab and into this different career. I know I work with quite a lot of younger researchers and scientists, and they're often thinking like, what is that transition like? Because you did that, right? You were a scientist in the lab, and then you moved into this other career, which was sort of quite multifaceted. What kind of capacities do you need to build, inner capacities within yourself to be able to do that? And what are the resources that, you know, what is that journey like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think for me, having done my PhD, I knew by the end of that, you know, I loved being in the lab. I loved the science, but actually that's probably not where I can best add value and sort of really sort of contribute. So yeah, in the role I'm at now, I get to still be very much connected to that, but you know, I'm adding value in different ways. So in terms of my journey, so I up until recently was working more in technology transfer, so working very closely with academics around how to get their research out of the lab, and now I'm in sort of a more business development role, but it's sort of very similar in terms of trying to help progress technologies and get them to patients essentially. I think when you initially start thinking about that step out of the lab, it can be quite challenging because I think as scientists, you know, we identify ourselves as scientists and it's a bit of a badge of honor. And I think, you know, you sort of think solely about being in the lab and you know, wearing your lab coat, and that's what a scientist is. But actually, when you start thinking more broadly, you know, scientists exist in all sorts of places, and I still consider myself a scientist even though I'm not sort of doing wet lab work. So I think mentally sort of getting over that mental barrier is the first step. I think the second thing is just doing your research. So there's actually lots of information available online around sort of alternative careers and how you can apply your science skills and the sort of academic rigor that comes with that to other professions. There's lots out there. I mean, certainly from a LifeArc perspective, we have various fellowship programs that we offer for sort of getting into technology transfer as a profession, and we also have online resources. So we've got a sort of work experience simulator that's sort of open for anyone to engage with, and that can be quite a good way of sort of dipping your toe into exploring other options if you're not quite sure as to whether you want to stay in the lab or sort of transition into another sort of role.
Thank you, and great to know about those resources as well on the LifeArc website. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think it leaves it just to me to thank all our participants for showing up today and for engaging. It's always wonderful to have you. And then a huge thank you to Laura and to LifeArc for letting us have you for an hour. And thank you so much. I know this, it's bridging the gap between the global north and what we're doing in here in Africa is these kinds of experiences really help to do that and help to build, what we're trying support what we're trying to build on the continent to get this perspective from places, organizations like LifeArc. So I really thank you so much for giving us your time and passion. And it's been wonderful to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's been fantastic.